So I want to welcome you. I'm Saskia Sassen. I want to welcome you to this Think-in. We started with a lunch discussion among the main speakers that set sort of the tone. It allowed us to explore the subject. This is one of the projects of the Committee on Global Thought. The Committee on Global Thought was an idea of President Lee Bollinger. And the project of the Committee on Global Thought is really around the question of knowledge. It is not, let's say, global studies as an empirical practice. It is more trying to understand how can we both use and change the established categories of meaning that we use across the social sciences and other sciences, in fact, history, literature, that we have used in the past and we keep on using today to understand the world, to make meaning. How can we sort of use those categories, change them around in order to map something about our current condition? The hope is that in developing some of these categories, we can then also develop new types of research projects. And it definitely will include a lot of sort of movement and communication across disciplines. So the Committee on Global Thought has members from several disciplines, and we're now going to add also people from the sciences, so that in a way there is a kind of emergent knowledge space that requires multiple forms of expertise, of knowledge, etc. This is not new. But today there is a kind of urgency about it. And as you know, Columbia University is very keen on positioning itself in this type of project. Now, today's Think-in deals with, which is the first one that we have done, deals with the issue of governance, a very ambiguous term, a very elusive term in many ways. And during lunch, we began the discussion, what does the concept mean? What is the history? What is its trajectory? What does it mean today? The fact that we're discussing it does not necessarily mean that we love it. Huh? You know how we academics are. We may discuss it in order to kill it. But the notion is really opening up new vistas, rethinking these foundational categories. We have three great speakers, and let me very quickly introduce them. Mark Mazower, who is also hosting us here in his center, this wonderful center, one of the great institutions on the campus. Mark Mazower is a historian and writer. I'm sure many of you know him, but let me just say it in case there are some who might not. Specializing in modern Greece, 20th century Europe, and international history. His most recent book is Governing the World, the History of an Idea. Then we have Partha Chatterjee, a political theorist and historian, divides his time between Columbia University and the Center for Studies in the Social Sciences in Calcutta, where he is the director, or was a director for 10 years. He's the author of many books. And is one of the founding member of the Subaltern Studies Collective. One of his most recent books is Partha, the Black Hole. Tell me again the title. You didn't give us the title.
The Black Hole of Empire.
The Black Hole. I know that there was a black hole, but of empire. Very good. And Katharina Pister is a professor of the law in comparative law, institutions and systems. She was trained in Germany, studied Chinese and Soviet law in London, very global, and teaches at our university here at our law school. She's the director of the school Center on Global Legal Transformation. Much of her research explores the diversity of legal institutions and the differences among legal systems. In the past, she researched the transformation of legal systems in the former socialist world and other emerging markets. And Katharina, you will moderate this event, right? Now, a few more things about the CGT. Our next Think-in is going to be later in the year. The title is Making Scientific Evidence fit for human use, where we're going to mix, again, very different types of knowledge. On November the 4th, we have one of our signature research project events organized by Karol Gluck, which is the politics of memory in global context. It is on November the 4th at 6:30 p.m. The details will be advertised on our website, okay? But it is at the National 9/11 Museum. It will be a public symposium on remembering the past in public, and it will be followed by a workshop here at the university. Again, we will post all the details on our website and also on the campus sort of advertising site. Now, we also wanted to let you all know that we have developed a new master's in global thought. And since many of you may know people who are interested, we are starting this fall. It's going to be different from any other master. The faculty will be the members of the Committee on Global Thought. So please, please get in touch with us, any one of us, if you know of anybody who might be interested. Yes, this is a pitch I'm giving you. I think that is it for me. And Katharina, you take over. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So thank you all for coming. We will just have brief introductions amongst ourselves and maybe some comments, and then invite comments from the floor. The big question on the table is how to think about this concept of global governance. And that really means, of course, for academics, is how to unpack the concept of global governance. And we have spent sort of the lunch unpacking it in different ways. So we've thought about the historical origins of the concept of governance, in particular, and how it became global governance. We have thought about its relationship to governments or governmentality. We've thought about how it relates to different modes of government, central or decentral, how it relates to questions of accountability or time horizons. What is the role of experts in governance as opposed to politicians? And the ultimate question is, do we actually have a right concept to think about global governance to adequately describe the various modes of governance that we observe around us today? So I don't want to really say more than that currently, just to throw out the different ways in which we thought to unpack this concept, and I will give Mark Mazower the floor first to introduce us to this problem from his particular perspective, and maybe he will say again a few words where you're coming from and what your take on it is, and then we'll just share a few comments from the two of us as well. Please, Mark.
Sure, thank you. Well, I'm basically a historian, and so I come at this historically, but it seems to me that this is a kind of both a real-world problem and a conceptual problem. And one of the things we were wrestling with was how do you link these two very slippery concepts, the global and governance, to the real world, because any discussion of this seems to stem from the fact that we think something somewhere needs fixing. If we thought everything was fine, we wouldn't be sitting around discussing global governance. We want to discuss global governance because in some realm or another, in multiple realms, we think there are problems to be fixed. And so it's in the nature of the discussion that there's a descriptive dimension and there's a prescriptive dimension. And I think it's fair to say in the morning we did somewhat find ourselves moving from one to the other, from people who were describing what they think is actually going on in this very complicated real world to people describing what they thought should go on. As I say, from my vantage point, I came to see this discussion as at the end of a long history of thinking not about the global, because the global, like governance, is a term that only really gets going in the 1980s and the 1990s, and I'll come to that in a minute. But thinking about the international and international government, and also international cooperation. And that's a 19th century story, and I won't say very much about it, except it's the term international gained currency in the 1830s, not before. Nobody in the 18th century uses the term. So it's a question for people living after the defeat of Napoleon, and it's a question for people in the first place in Europe. And the 19th century story is a story of multiple conceptions of international cooperation. There is one that is inherently conservative. We will stop war by monarchical states banding together to prevent insurrections and rebellions. And then all the other varieties of internationalism are in fact conceptualized in opposition to that one as self-consciously radical. And I'll give you just a few examples because I think that we're the heirs to them today. One would be proletarian cooperation. Well, that's rather lost its allure. Free trade certainly hasn't. Free trade as a form of internationalist sentiment. Scientific rationality, the idea in the 19th century that if you allow professional scientists to band together, they can not only solve the problem of cholera, but they can do many other things. Just keep politicians out of the way. They're the ones who get in the way. At exactly the same time, the invention of the discipline of international law, premised rather similarly on the idea that, again, keep the politicians out of the way, leave it to these professionals to create a new language for states to conduct their relations in a neutral scientific spirit, the spirit of international law, and goodness knows that's very much alive. So there is a 19th century story which is a story of ideas, and then the 20th century story is the story in which some of these ideas are taken up at different times by powers, primarily great powers, and institutionalized. And so it becomes the history of international politics. And so you have to understand why powers take up some of these ideas and not others, why they didn't conduct diplomacy in the old way, because states had been conducting diplomacy for centuries without international organizations. So there is a big question that the literature doesn't answer, which is why at certain points the world's most powerful states, British Empire and the United States, should have felt it necessary to throw their weight behind international organizations. And then there's a story about international politics through the 20th century. So you move from a story of ideas to a story of institutions. In the 1980s, people start getting interested in globality. And there is actually some quite good work done on the emergence of the vocabulary of the global in the 1980s and the 1990s, initially in the realm of trade, actually, and then in the realm of finance. So we were sitting at Columbia in the 1950s. There would have been no CGT. There would have been no discussion on global governance. People wouldn't have thought about the global. So for me, that sets off a warning bell. Let's figure out what was at stake there. And the same thing in an entirely different, well, no, not entirely different, it's a somewhat different domain. People start talking for the first time about governance. And we had a long discussion this morning about the origins of the concept of governance. And my own view, in brief, is that it emerges out of business schools and the corporate world. And it is ambivalent, because there is one conception of corporate governance which is prompted by business managers who feel that they should do much more in the running of their business, not only for their shareholders, that's how it starts, but then for stakeholders and society in general. It's a kind of ethical dimension. And there is another conception of governance that says businesses have been crushed by big government, and we need to move to a relationship between the public and the private that favours the private over the public. And then this is taken up in the 1990s by Kofi Annan and the UN, and we're into the realm of global governance, and evidently from today we're still in the era of global governance, and much, much more to be said about the politics behind this term, the multiple politics. All I want to say, which should now be obvious to me at any rate, it seems quite clear that neither the term global nor the term governance is a neutral scientific term. It has baggage. I'll give you my own rather contentious view on this. What is happening is that people start talking about governance at the moment in which they lose faith in government. So the realm of big government, which lasts from, let's say, 1920 to 1970, ends, and as it ends, people start talking about governance. So there is a kind of shrinkage and evaporation of meaning, and simultaneously a very rapid expansion, we're talking about the 80s and 90s, of demands and competences expected of international organizations. If you know anything about the history of the UN, you'll know that its position is entirely transformed in the post-Cold War era, initially through the expansion of peacekeeping and other things. So at the very moment where this concept is emerging that articulates a very defensive attitude to what public officials can do, the zone of expectation for international organizations, which have traditionally been very weak, is rapidly expanding. So just a couple of thoughts and then I will end. So to understand all of this, or some of this, involves one firstly figuring out the very complicated history of international organizations, which is very boring, frankly. People would say to me, I hear you're writing a history of the UN. I go, heaven forfend, that's the last thing I want to do. I mean, what a boring thing to write. So you have to figure it out, even though they're boring. They're boring partly because they're powerless so much of the time. So it makes no point to write a history of the UN with a few exceptions, IMF at certain times and so forth. You have to write a history of what their role is in the ecology of international politics in general. What's the relationship between the UN and the US government? Now that starts to get more interesting. Okay, so there's that. And then, and this I think was lurking in the background this morning, but we could say more about it, the question of place, of perspective, right? This tends to be a very first world, we all met in Davos and then we all met in Washington and then we all met in Brussels kind of story. How do you link this up to a very sharp sense of place, especially given that what we're supposedly talking about is the global? And then the last thing that I want to flag, because it didn't come up this morning, and I think it has to be in there, it seems to me that one of the things that is at stake, to my mind somewhat disturbingly, in the shift of meaning from government to governance, is the whole question of ethics. One of the things that really strikes you about the internationalists of whatever stripe in the 19th century is they all think of what they're doing as a project of public ethics. They all think this is about the public good. And so it seems to me that you move from a way of thinking about running affairs through government, which is unavoidably a way of thinking about the public good, to a way of thinking about governance where the whole notion of the public good morphs into the notion of the shareholders' good or the stakeholders' good, and or the good of best practice, many other kinds of goods. But actually what happens in this is the whole ethical question gets really relegated to second place, and that this is particularly problematic, would be problematic domestically, but it's particularly problematic when you're dealing with international organizations, for the simple reason that international organizations have an accountability problem built into them from the start. Because the way international organizations had emerged was emphatically not on the basis that they represented the interest of a single political community. We associate that with the notion of world government, and world government is the one unambiguous victim in the whole 200-year story. I mean, nobody apart from H.G. Wells believes in world government. It never goes anywhere. You get different forms of international bodies, and they have to articulate their own relationship to democracy or to the public good in a different kind of way. So that's always a problem for them. So the ethical issue is a particularly big one there already, and then starting to talk about them in terms of governance makes it doubly difficult. I'll stop there.
Partha, do you want to go ahead?
Okay. Well, Marx already introduced the sort of historical dimension of those two terms, the global and the governance. And both, as he points out, are very recent. Although the ideas behind them are much older, as he was trying to explain, certainly from the 19th century onwards. Just to take up the argument from there, there's just one side, or let's say two aspects of the history of the idea of governance, which seems to me interesting in terms of the older lineages going back to the early 19th century. And that's the sort of imperial colonial heritage of this idea of governance across the world. Because that itself is not new. It's very much part of the idea of modern empires, European empires in different parts of the world, and how they were to be administered. And there are two particularly important sort of conceptual questions there, which I think were proposed and established and continue to remain with us to this day. The first was the idea that governments everywhere in the world, can somehow be compared and measured according to some single standard. That is to say, governments everywhere can be graded and ranked next to each other. So this is where you begin to get the arguments. This did not exist earlier on in European thinking. I mean, there was no way of trying to say that, let's say, Oriental despotisms could be ranked against some other European concept. I mean, they were completely incommensurable things. They become commensurable. And as a result, what you begin to get is the possibility of thinking of administrative methods, administrative techniques, as it were, that would be appropriate to governments in different social contexts, according to what was the 19th century concept, levels of development, levels of civilization, etc., etc. And different kinds of techniques would be appropriate to each of these things, all with the ultimate aim of raising these backward societies to some acceptable level or normative level. Now, this is something that the history of colonial governments through the 19th century actually established within the world of government generally, the understanding of government generally. The second thing, I think, that was important about colonial administration through the 19th century was that at the same time that in the countries of Western Europe, Britain or France or Holland, through the 19th century you get increasing democratization of the home governments, the metropolitan governments, increasing increase of the suffrage, a sense that government must be accountable to the people, etc., etc. At the same time, you get the very clear argument that colonial administration is best left to experts. That this, in fact, should not be a topic of partisan politics at home, because, in fact, politicians, as well as the ordinary electorate, has no idea of these distant places and how they ought to be governed. So leave that to experts. I think those two things are important in trying to understand what global governance might mean today, because they are in some ways constitutive of the sort of changes that have taken place, the sort of things that Mark was describing since the 1980s. What happens in the 1980s? I think if you look back at the 20th century, through the period of certainly the World War I onwards, I mean, the idea of the international is older from the 19th century, but that was an idea of internationalism that was entirely restricted to the European world. It meant the internationalism among the European countries. From the 20th century onwards, so you get, on the one side, you have the League of Nations kind of arguments. On the other, you have the Communist International, which is the parallel and competing idea of internationalism. You begin to get a new kind of argument, which basically suggests that the normal form of the modern state everywhere, the normal form of the modern state everywhere must be that of a nation state. In other words, somehow the argument begins to gain almost universal acceptance that the only properly legitimate form of the modern state is a nation state that is based upon some notion of popular sovereignty. It's not necessarily democratic, but the idea that government must that a government must rule in the name of a people becomes universalized. Now, that is, of course, what actually comes into place after World War II, certainly from the 1960s onwards, with the end of the old colonial empires. You begin to get basically the whole world consisting of nation states. Now, this period actually lasts for a very short time. I think one of the things that happens in the 1980s is a sense that most of these new states, or at least a very large number of these new states, are actually failing in what they're meant to be doing. they are failing to govern, they're failing to protect their own peoples, that they end up in being corrupt, autocratic regimes. And that is the context when you begin to get a different argument about, and both of these two terms now come into circulation. Instead of international, you begin to hear global. And instead of government, you begin to hear governance. And I think it's interesting to ask why. Why those two things? The idea of global, in a sense, displaces the idea that the nation state is the only legitimate political form. The argument is that the world is not simply just an international space where the basic units are necessarily only nation states. That the world can, in fact, be thought of or conceptualized in other terms, and that the new term becomes global. And on the side of government, the argument is that the technical part of administration is best left outside the domain of politics. That you can actually think of the functions of government as being carried out and carried out better, not by politicians, not by elected politicians who have to think of the next election, but in fact by experts who know their business, who know the business of administration. Now those two things, I think, end up from the 1980s into this new discourse of global governance. And essentially what it does is, it doesn't openly challenge the idea. So therefore, instead of saying global government, right, which would of course have challenged the basic idea that the founding principle of all legitimate government is somehow the nation state and its people. That would have been challenged. It's not openly challenged. So in fact, a different term is introduced. But a lot of the functions of government are in fact taken over by regulatory bodies, by a whole series of international organizations. We can come back to the various areas where functions which even internationally would have been performed earlier by states or the representatives of states or agencies peopled by representatives of states are now carried out by non-state organizations and entities. So that is one important thing. But the other interesting aspect to this seems to be that whereas the traditional idea of government as we have known it always implies a certain founding set of rules or laws, which broadly speaking we call the constitutional form of government, right? Which could include the sort of most very widely known things like the separation of powers between different branches of government, checks and balances, all of those kinds of things, accountability to the people, etc. Government still bears that baggage. Whereas the idea of governance, in a sense, suggests that the best way to carry out the functions of government is not necessarily through those constitutionally regulated forms. It could be better done through other forms of regulation, right? And this, I think, is an interesting and important aspect, so that, in fact, large sectors of government activities, which earlier were carried out by politically constituted governments, are now being carried out by a whole range of other non-governmental institutions. But each of them it's not that it's completely unregulated or lawless, but the proper constitution of each sector is the suggestion is that there can't be a single principle which will regulate all of these sectors. So, for instance, the world of finance must be constituted and regulated in one particular kind of way. The world of, I don't know, nuclear science will be regulated in a different kind of way. Health, to the extent that it requires a global governance, must be constituted in a different kind of way. And I think that is precisely where you're beginning to get a whole multiplicity of governing principles applicable to each of these areas, where the traditional idea of a constitution-bound government does not apply anymore. So that seems to me an important aspect. And finally, there is an argument which is implicit in all this, which is that the performance of governance has to be judged by its results or outputs. And there are different ways that are often suggested as to how you measure this and who does the measuring, and so on. So this is a whole new area that's emerged. Finally, let me raise this question about the different regional viewpoints. Where is the global located, as it were? One of the things that's part of the idea of the global is the global north and the global south. That's a broad geographical way in which much of this is described. But there are actual institutional forms that correspond to something like this. So something like the G7, or now you have an expanded G20, right? Which clearly is a demarcation of the economic importance of particular countries in relation to others. And then you did have, I suppose it doesn't exist very much anymore, the idea of a global south, which in fact there was something like the G77 at one point in time. I think that's now long that moment is past. But you also have what's often referred to as the BRICS, the sort of new emerging countries, which in fact are making a claim to either a share in existing governmental institutions that govern the world of the economy or the finance, or they're in fact suggesting that we will, if not, we will set up a rival set of institutions. So where that goes, we still don't know. So in fact, it's not as though the world of global governance is necessarily uniquely and consensually regulated. There are considerable contestations within that world. And finally, we also have a world of, and this is where Mark, I think, was raising this, or hinting at this question, which is the whole range of global, you might call them social movements, non-governmental movements, which is not the big powers. On environment, on indigenous rights, on controlling the multinationals. There are a whole range of things on which these kinds of things have happened. It's still very unclear if there is or is not an institutional form to this, but that is precisely raising this question of a public. Implicitly, there is a sense of a global public to which global forms of governance ought to be accountable. And it is in some ways trying to invoke this global public. It's through these kinds of movements that is sometimes being invoked. To what extent that's effective is another matter. We can talk about that.
Thank you very much. Let me just add a few comments here, maybe bring in a different perspective. So as you can hear already from the two other commentators, the disciplines that we work in and particular questions that we have pursued, and to some extent where we come from, shapes the way we approach these questions. And so let me just say that I come to this topic as somebody who has done a lot of comparative research on different legal systems. And I'm looking sort of at the globe and more bottom up than top down. I'm looking at how different systems are being reconfigured through law in our period of globalization. We had a little bit of a discussion over lunch also about the fact that actually we have moved increasingly from the ability of states to fulfill their universalist claim to really govern all aspects of life of the societies that belong to these states, to one where we see increasingly governance within domains that cut across states. Finance, climate change, information technology, you could add nuclear problems, public health. So there's the point here is that maybe we have to step back and think about not only what is now the role of the states and how it's being transformed in the global world, but also think about how these new domains are emerging and how they have global reach. So global governance might not just be moving governance up from the national level to the international or global level, but understanding how different domains reach out and occupy different spaces, for better or for worse. We can have a normative debate about how this happens as well. But for me, the key question is, how does it happen? So I think of law as one of these technologies that allow you to scale beyond the nation states. I think first law came in actually to scale up from the local to the nation state. The creation of national legal system is, of course, part of the nation building project. But we've been able to dislodge global relations from the nation states by allowing individual actors, economic actors, to travel with them, to use foreign contract law to govern their contracts, to incorporate their corporations somewhere else, to do business in the big financial centers, no matter where they're from, to capture different legal systems for particular purposes by reincorporating a subsidiary somewhere else. You can give many other examples. So I think law is not the only exclusive scaling technology, but it's one that allows us to increase our reach from the local to the global, from the local to the national, and from the national to the global eventually. And that, of course, poses challenges to nation states and also to our international legal order. Just to pull these two things together that Partha and Mark were saying. Mark was saying in the 19th century, the international public law was invented as sort of this new discipline to deal with diplomatic and power relations. And Partha was saying, and we also said, everybody has to be a nation state. In public international law, to this day, only states talk to each other, right? We're sort of still having these debates where the international individuals are subjects of international law to some extent. Yes, corporations, the answer is no, right? They have no responsibilities. They claim rights under international law, but they don't have responsibilities. So in our public international legal order that is confined to the 19th century, only states can talk to each other. And so the notion that we can now, we then think about the international legal order, then we have local delegation to the nation states, and there might be some indirect form of accountability. The world I'm trying to describe is to say, well, we're using some select legal institutions, maybe other technologies, that are transposing or reaching out beyond nation states and don't have accountability to the broader public, as you suggest, but to certain stakeholders. We're creating club goods within the domains that we have created, and that poses challenges for those who are outside these clubs more generally. So I think what we're saying is sort of complements each other, but you get quite different perspectives on how one could start to think about global governance. I think they're all important to understand where it comes from, when governance is used as a concept to disguise certain things. What we are trying to find out is a way to describe what is happening without falling into the trap of old vocabulary. And that's really hard. I was just thinking also when you were talking about internationalism in the 19th century, that's when it was invented. Before that, people were talking about universalism, right? So there was the universal imperial law of the big empires in Europe, the church, and increasingly actually in the economic sphere, people talked about the universal merchant law, right? So there was universalism, then we had internationalism, now we have globalism. I think they do describe different phenomena, but we lack a little bit the vocabulary and conceptual tools to explain them. And so I just want to open up the discussion to see whether you can help us do that. So I will keep the queue. Keep your remarks relatively brief, so lots of people can speak if they wish to, and then we will take turns on answering this. First, second, yes, please, go ahead. Yes.
Hi, I'm Alexi. I'm a student here at Columbia University. For This is very interesting because you both mentioned something about ethics, about accountability, responsibility, government policy, and also about the international government and others between the states. And you mentioned about non-state actors that kind of fill the void, right? And to me, it's interesting to see how do we look at kind of stop looking at the national interest. Right? We always talk about government that represents the interest of the people, right? And national interest is very important. What if the interests are no longer national? What if there are groups of people who are not bound anymore by geography, right? But they're bound by other things, ideology and preferences. Right? So you have the mobile classes and
financial conditions. Sorry.
One after the other.
So, for example, there's one class, and there are maybe displaced people, right? And those are not necessarily divided between North and South. You have displaced in the South, you have displaced people, by hurricanes in the US. So it's no longer, rich countries and poor countries, but it's interests of one kind of class of people that share ideology across the world, and now more connected than ever, right? And other classes, how do you kind of balance those interests, and what do you create the form that balances them?
Let me take 2 or 3 questions in a row, and then we'll try to answer. So you
Yeah, I'm Doug Chalmers. I used to teach here in the political science department. The issue is that I wanted to address was the notion of governance, because Mark talked about the associations with the word governance, and the association that I have is with a kind of pluralism and a trenchancy. The idea that people come together around a particular issue or a particular topic, it may be the kinds of things you were talking about, actually, but that it creates a sort of decision network of people who are working together in order to make some kind of a decision about this. And I think that actually I wrote about this in a book which is devoted to subnational government, the subnational in space at any rate. And my conclusion was that the problem is even greater, because it's not only that there are these subgroups that cross boundaries and so forth and so on that take on themselves the it was referred to as the experts, but I'm not sure that doesn't suggest the wrong language, because it's the most involved, and the most involved may not be people who would be normally called experts, but it's the people come together in order to, and one of the significant factors, qualities of these groups is that they don't last. They come together and then they disappear. And the whole question of how law relates to a transient sort of arrangement seems to me to be extraordinarily complicated.
Let's take one more.
Yes. It's for Katerina, but it's for the whole panel, actually. You said that law is one of the processes or technologies that scales internationally. What would be the other technologies besides law that you think scale internationally? And how would you classify those technologies into what different classes or methodologies? The law requires state support. So would you break down technologies that require state support or endorsement versus those that don't, such as ideologies? How would you go about thinking about that so you could think about connecting the macro to the micro?
Okay. Who wants to go first? Pick your first question.
Okay, so I'll go for some combination of the first two. These were both about subgroups, non-governmental groups that may have commonalities of interest or purposes across borders, if I understood things. There might be a decision network, they might be capable of making decisions, they might not, they might be more or less long-lived. A lot of the governance debate, when it became applied globally in the 1990s, was about what the role of NGOs should be, for instance, as one example of such organizations. And I think one of the things that has become clear is that, again, the term is too broad. Even the term NGO, it's essentially a negative term, right? We're just dealing with some group of actors who get together over some cause who are not governmental. Although, in fact, to confuse matters further, of course, if you go into this, you'll know there are some governmental, non-governmental organizations. But the idea for those who thought governance was a good thing was that opening the ambit of debate to as many different actors as possible would enhance the democratic quality of the decision making. And so it was opened. And then it seems to me, I'm not going to pronounce on whether that had good outcomes or not, but that what we realized was immediately you started getting rapid differentiation between different kinds of groups within this non-governmental world. So that your question, in a way, betrays the idea that we still inherit from the 19th century, that it is the governmental state organizations that form the monads. And the problem is then when we say, well, what do we think about ordinary people or some other category that stands in? But we start finding ourselves using a category that applies to, an organization that bans migrants fleeing oppression. How does that compare with an organization of trade producers of some rare commodity? They both, as I understand it, fill your definition. But in terms of what power they may have over policy, what relationship they have to the policy process, they look completely different. Even a small NGO compared with a very well-established NGO, which may have certain rights in international organizations that others do not. I lack the vocabulary for being able to think analytically about this world in a descriptive sense. And that's before we get on to the prescriptive question of whether this is in fact a good thing. Because one of the things that does strike me is there was a lot of kind of rosy-eyed optimism about, a lot of this was driven by the desire to democratize international institutions because the fact that their members were states was thought to delegitimize them. And it was assumed that allowing civil society, the other great term in vogue at that time, was going to re-legitimize them. But it seems to me you still have an accountability problem with a lot of these projects. I mean, nobody voted for them. And as I say, even within the realm of human rights, an Amnesty International is an entirely different kind of body from a Human Rights Watch in the way it's structured, in the way it functions, and so on. So it seems, I feel myself to be at a very primitive level in trying to analyze what is actually happening, and in no position at all to say anything about what I think should happen.
Again, on those two things, you see, on this question of the national versus all of those groups that get left out within the national, right? I mean, first of all, the national interest was never really about everybody within a nation being included within that. I mean, this was obviously dependent upon a particular kind of political process within a national state, right? And obviously, in every case, some people were necessarily left out and felt marginalized and not included within the so-called, whatever was called national interest. But I think the important thing to note is this. There was a period, let's say in the 20th century, when the understanding was that all of those contestations are best fought out within the space of a national politics, a domestic politics, right? Which should have its own rules. And it's within those rules that you fight this out. I think increasingly, and this connects with what Mark is suggesting, that because of the fact that the nation-state form itself has become delegitimized to a considerable extent, now you're beginning to get far more examples of precisely these excluded, marginalized groups within a nation actually connecting up with others in other places, right? And then claiming, but we can't actually fight for our rights within the national space. We have to do something else. We have to find another place. And there the variety is incredible. I mean, you can get all these jihadi groups, fighting for a completely different kind of state altogether. You can find all the social movements on climate change. All right, or you can get business groups, as Mark was suggesting, claiming that the nation state does not serve our interests and we need some other international or global forum to fight this out. Secondly, on this question of these groups sort of temporarily coming together to solve specific problems, I think you're completely right. But one of the interesting things to notice there is that there are no prior fundamental rules set within which these decisions have to be made. In other words, there is no prior constitutional agreement, right? The rules have to be made up as they go along. And as you say, in many of these cases, they don't last. Once either the problem is resolved in some satisfactory way, or they give it up, right? I think that's where the idea of the experts is somewhat different, because the idea of solving these problems through experts actually carries with it an argument that there is both continuity, and the continuity is through a professional discipline and an expertise, right? Which itself is guaranteed that there will be memory, there will be continuity, that people will learn from previous experience, even though a specific set of people may be a different set of people. But because of their affiliation to a particular disciplinary practice within an expertise, whether it's law, whether it's finance, or whatever it is, there is a sense that there is continuity.
Thank you. Let me just briefly answer that question. So I think it's a great question. What other transmission mechanisms are there in addition to law for global outreach? I think social networks, information technology supports social networks. Ideology is part of that. I think so. This is basically why you would join a particular social network is an important one, and we've seen this historically. Ethnically linked groups that actually, were able sort of to trade across the Mediterranean or trade to this day in the Chinese diaspora beyond nation states in the Southern Pacific. So there's not only law, there are lots of, sort of socially embedded structures that allow you to reach out. I think the beauty of law is the scale you can reach, by basically having states still commit to enforce without necessarily having the states get in the way of shaping the norms. And just to add one comment on the issue of the disappearance, this is one of the fundamental problems, I think, as increasingly people are left out of formulating the goals, framing the goals of governance, and creating institutions that ensure lasting commitments to certain goals and some form of accountability. You have an increasingly phenomenon that I think Hannah Arendt described, right? That those that are stateless are the least powerful people in the world. And as we decline the role of the states, I think we have lots of stateless people or governless people, if you want. Okay, I have 3 more people on my list, so you go first, then I have Ken and then I have and I will keep the 2 for the next round. So why don't you go first?
Yeah, my question is, I hope I can, let me try. Is the United Nations then, as an institution, automatically delegitimized? And if so, does that mean chaos? And also, when you deal with these institutions that have given license, sometimes politically, sometimes in some way of legitimization between the United Nations and the government that are empowered to do this kind of decisions, who legitimizes this representation when there's something good happen, like what is going on now in Iraq and Syria and the rest of the Middle East, bomba? Mm-hmm. And who paid this extension bill to make it poetic, meaning financially? And I love the element of language and vocabulary, because we don't have it. And if we don't have it, we don't talk to each other because we don't want to offend anybody, especially the educated kind. Boss, you all guys. So that's what it means. The problem is, I just talk to people in the street all the time, doing media, doing things. And the concern seems to be that, especially those people who come as a result of victims of the war, that don't get that much giving space for that. But my concern is in terms of the actual representation, because that thing of chaotic is really hurting a lot of people and killing a lot of people, by the way.
Ken, faculty, I'd like to talk a little bit about, or ask a question about how you get global scholarly knowledge to connect to studying global stuff. Mm-hmm. And I suspect that I could posit that if we talked for an hour, we would come to a pretty common understanding of what we think scholarly knowledge is. It's transparent, it's replicable, it's sort of in the public good, it's about a process, not a catalog of truths, et cetera, et cetera. We can define this thing called scholarly knowledge, I think. And this I'm certain of. If you go to the mission statements of most research universities in the world, if you go to the mission statements of funding sources, especially nation-state funding sources, but including a lot of private sector funding sources, the mission statements almost always say something to this effect. I overstate it, but nevertheless. We're investing in this because we want to win the economic contest. We're investing in this because we want to protect our country from the bad guys out there. We're investing in this because we care about our... In other words, the investment is about a payoff for the nation state. So how do we create a global scholarly knowledge, which is more than just adding up all the pieces that you get from a bunch of nation state systems that are organized, at least according to the funders, organized around payoff for their own home base.
Okay.
There's just three very closely related and quick questions. Partha, you stressed the historical depth that comes from the need to focus on colonialism and understanding some of these issues. And I'm just curious about I wanted you to relate it to Marx's descriptions of some of the issues of international relations and the social sciences. But it is a peculiar thing about the theme of colonialism that in the last few decades, it really caught fire in a very distant and odd place, which is the English departments and conflict departments, partly because of the social sciences abdication of issues of that kind, I think. And I'm just curious about the kind of trajectory, intellectual trajectory that produced, where it took place in a site that is relatively distant from where the knowledgeable things should be, were they to be responsibly addressed by those disciplines. So that's just a question really about disciplinary matters. But relating to the colonial issue, I was just curious, when you moved on to talk about new forms of globalization since decolonization, you mentioned that the term governance came into focus, and governance was done by these bodies which were not governments. But was there a kind of replication of these things which came from just bad representation in these governance bodies, which left out the representation of other countries? And all this stuff on BRICS and so on is just a sign that when you now try and contest these resistances, which in an earlier form took the form of decolonization and national movements, have to come through South-South alliances rather than national movements of that kind. And then the question is, relatedly, are these South-South alliances that come with things like BRICS and all really speaking for the elites in those regions or not? And this goes back to some of the questions you raised in your responses to it, because here's a simple way of putting it. Take something like welfare or safety nets for the worse off. Mm-hmm. So far as I know, there are no mechanisms at any supranational site to dispense welfare. I just don't know what it mind boggles at, given the current situation, at what mechanisms for welfare would be at any site but the national site, at any supranational site. So So when you form these South-South alliances, which are supranational alliances, what would happen to issues like this? Or should we just say labor as a mobilizing category is done, there's just nothing to be done? And, I just don't, we don't have a sense of how to even begin to theorize about it. That's it.
Okay, so we have 3 questions again. Let's just find brief answers so we get more people into the conversation.
So I thought it was a very interesting question about whether the UN as an institution is delegitimized. Chateaubriand basically said there are 2 things that you need to acquire legitimacy: prudence, i.e. don't do anything stupid, and just last. And from that perspective, the UN is, right? The UN is actually on the way to legitimizing itself rather effectively, much more effectively than the League of Nations did, because it has lasted and it has not done anything too stupid. And what strikes me about the literature on the UN, the UN either elicits kind of warmly positive feelings in people which shape what they write, or if you read, this fantastic Left Behind literature. I don't know if anybody else has ever read the Left Behind books. The coming of the end times. The UN is the arch Satan. But actually, what we have to do more than anything else is learn how to analyze the UN as an ordinary political institution. And that's very, very difficult, because the UN's primary power was its symbolic power. And I think it's still, to a large extent, its symbolic power. And I think there are reasons for that, and I think it survives. As far as I can see, the UN remains a relatively minor but symbolically important part of the international landscape. And will its delegitimization lead to chaos? Well, it depends on your definition of chaos, because, as you said, in fact, in many parts of the world, there's chaos right now. And yet the UN is there, and there has been plenty of chaos over the last 60 or 70 years. I think the fault comes in thinking that the UN, if it's legitimate, would cease war and cease chaos. And I think that is the burden that the UN has to bear. And then briefly on the... so in a way, when I was writing about the history of the UN and the idea of governing the world, it was an attempt to kind of scale back expectations through history. Global scholarly knowledge, what would that look like beyond the narrow concerns of national states and so on? Well, all I want to say about that is that, in the 19th century view would have been there was no problem, because there was no incompatibility between speaking for your national audience and speaking for an international audience. And the national and the international were completely compatible. In fact, you couldn't have, for most internationalists, a genuine international order without robust national sentiment. And what's interesting is we flip this. We see nation states as the problem, and actually now, as we've been saying, as the problem for international organizations too. And so that creates the predicament that you describe. But given that there is no universal language, given that our educational systems are national, it seems to me there's a lot of mileage yet in the 19th century view that your language has to speak to people through their national predicaments, so those that are shared, which exist. That's very abstract.
On the UN, in some ways, the UN was designed to be an institution which would only work when the big powers agreed. Right? If the big powers did not agree, the UN was meant not to work. Right? You would have a very different UN. You could end up with a hyperactive UN if, for instance, the General Assembly were to be the principal organ, right? But then, of course, you could argue that the big powers wouldn't let such an institution last, obviously. So there is, of course, as Mark was suggesting, that apart from the big political questions, the big security questions, which the Security Council is supposed to deal with, you do have a whole range of UN agencies which have, in fact, performed quite creditably in many ways. And that was the whole Kofi Annan project.
In the absence of the NGOs.
Exactly. Refugees, this, that. There's a whole range of things where the UN agencies have, in fact, been quite effective, precisely in those areas where there was no contentious political issue involved. Now, to Ken's question, how does one think of a way of doing global knowledge which is not conditioned by, let's say, these funding agencies and their priorities, which are very often nationally dictated. And yes, that's a genuine problem. I mean, my personal answer would be find ways of doing research that doesn't require funding. So it is possible to do it, but it would be extremely modest, right? On why you have this whole critique of empire in recent times in the literature departments. It's a very interesting observation. Does it have something to do with the fact that social sciences, in a sense, abandoned that trajectory? It could be. It also has to do with the fact that it's really again, since the 1970s or 80s, that within the literature departments there was a kind of critique mounted of the traditional ways of canonizing literature within each national context. So, and that also was because of the fact that, certainly in the case of English, for instance, you began to get all of these outputs of English language literature produced not in English language countries, but other places, right? And that required some, rethinking, reworking of the whole idea of a canon and what a canon might be. And so I think that's part of the reason. But I think, what relation this has to the social sciences is an interesting question. I don't have a ready answer to that. On the South-South question, there have been, I think there's one interesting argument that one could think of, particularly in relation to the rise of China and the earlier instance of, let's say, the rise of Japan and the way in which Japan, as it were, was included within an idea of, let's say, the G7, included Japan. But was it because, despite the fact that Japan was a non-Western economic power, and its economic power was recognized, it was nevertheless politically completely dominated by the Western alliance, right? In fact, it could never represent any kind of military threat. This was taken care of by the post-war peace agreement. This is not the case with China. And so the China clearly cannot be included in quite the same, or co-opted in quite the same way that Japan could be. And therefore the implication of the rise of China seems to me very different, because it has a whole range of political implications that you cannot separate from the economic part of China. So on the other hand, this question of the South-South cooperation, does that what implications that might be. That's not necessarily only a question of resistance, it seems to me. You could think of this whole BRICS thing as a kind of a claim to a rival empire or a share in empire. Why not? Look at China's role in Africa today. You have to reckon with those power ambitions as well.
So it's inter-imperial rivalry.
See, sometimes I think it's a kind of throwback to the period before World War I.
Yes,
I hope it's not. But
Saskia, on this?
Yes, I wanted to add something on the issue of the United Nations. So most recently, the UN made history, the beginning of a new history, when the General Assembly voted by a majority of 144 against only 11, headed by the United States, and the rest were absentees, to, for the first time in its history, say that it has a responsibility for economic issues. And it was around this whole debate of the vulture funds against Argentina. After that, the IMF, not the IMF, sorry, the G20, the Council of Human Rights in Geneva, they also said, we also have responsibility for human rights. Something that until then, for the economic issues, something that then had been the preserve of the specialized agencies, which are dominated by the most powerful countries. So I do think that, I just wanted to come back to if the General Assembly can be mobilized, I think that is very interesting, Because then we're really dealing with trajectories, new trajectories that might lead into very unexpected directions.
What this
Thanks.
again suggests is sort of the domain specificity, which we also have taken for granted. Just one final comment on this: the term BRICS, of course, was coined by a Goldman Sachs banker.
Yeah, that's right.
That much was solved.
O'Neill.
Yeah,
that's right.
And one more point in a similar direction on global knowledge, there's an enormous machinery of course out there to package global knowledge about certain issues in certain ways. I mean, you can go anywhere in the world and talk about good corporate governance. And everybody thinks exactly that they know what it means. It's completely absurd because it has very little relationship to the actual problems that firms on the ground face. But they've learned this through the World Bank. Another transmission mechanism is World Bank conditionality, World Bank advice. We have globalized experts, so that's what I think that transpose certain forms of knowledge to different parts of the world. What is much harder to transpose is the kind of critical knowledge that we're preaching here, because as critical study persons, we don't like stuff to generalize so much that we can package it and really have a fair competition globally. Okay, let me take a few more. I have three pages, 1, 2, 3, basically on that side of the. So I start with the red shirt and the blue suit and then the black. Yes, I have you guys black hair and black shirt. So that's how, the only way I can do this here. Sorry. Introduce yourself, please.
Yes,
So we can
thank
do
you.
better.
I'm Barry Herman, and I'm teaching at the New School, International Affairs. But I have some relations with the UN as well. So let me just add the comment that it's not done yet. There was a resolution.
Yeah, there was a resolution.
But the resolution calls for establishing modalities for negotiating, and it is possible, but not. Yeah, maybe not probable. It's possible that there will be some negotiations. But one of the things I wanted to emphasize is that I think the story, because nothing happens without the U.S. approval.
I know, that is the problem,
So
of
it's,
course.
yeah, so
You said
That might be a
US,
new
right?
beginning.
US.
the U.S. essentially,
I know.
and if they have a discussion, if they have a negotiation on debt workout principles and mechanisms, without the U.S., in fact, without the U.S. and the U.K., where the two major financial markets are, London and New York, it'll have no bearing.
But that has been this.
But wait, my point
Yes.
is only that the nation state is not done yet, and I think in the stories that were told before, like especially, I have to buy your book. That was a good advertisement for your book. But there's no mention of the Soviet Union and the Eastern group, and Putin is trying to reconstruct it. But so that what we have, I think, is the essentially U.S.-led Western group. I mean, there are different levels of control and of influence. But the nation state keeps fighting to maintain its role. Does in Europe, in the European Union, there's always great struggle how much authority will be given to the community, and they suffer as a result of it. And the same internationally. Just as an example, the International Monetary Fund agreed to a change in its governance. It means less influence for the Europeans, more for Brazil, China, and so on. But the U.S. still would have a veto. Now, this is not even approved yet by the Congress, and what is. There is flexibility. For example, at the UN, there was no agreement on having programs on innovative sources of financing for development. But France and Brazil, Lula and Chirac, started an initiative which has now grown, and it's become the leading group on innovative sources of financing for development. It has the airplane tax. If you fly into France or Chile or some other places, you pay a tax that goes to public health aids medicines. So there's room for transnational initiatives, but for anything important, nothing happens without the U.S. approval. In the same way, under the Eastern Bloc, nothing happened that Russia didn't want. And the problem, of course, is, I suppose, loss of confidence, loss of ideas in the U.S. about how to keep managing this system. So it's kind of defensive. But I think that's where there's a lot of tension in that.
My name is Rodolfo Valente, and I come from the UN Secretariat a few streets down the road. My question in my private capacity certainly is, it would be, if you take scholars like Craig Calhoun from the LSE and others who have highlighted that the way the international system deals with crisis has always been treating them as exceptional events rather than just, as Mark was mentioning, part of inherent chaos of the system that was created post the Second World War. And because of that, because we treat some of these crises as exceptions rather than daily business, we always create new means and sometimes ways that bypass democratic governance and so on to deal with this crisis. So there's a tendency to securitize everything, from climate change to very recently the Ebola crisis, calling it international peace and security threat, and therefore leaving some of the citizens, some of the power brokers that could be having more of a say to once again kind of hijack the agenda and to bring power politics back to the center of the discussion. So, question for this.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Ira Kovic. I'm from NYU. And the accountability problem was mentioned. And in NYU there is this research project called Global Administrative Law. And that's a project that is like endeavors to both describe and harness global power with the vocabulary of administrative law, and especially these procedural principles like presentation, transparency, reason giving, and review. And it seems to me that law as a rationality, it has kind of increased its prominence, and it kind of, the idea is kind of that it provides for predictability and stability and commensurability. But also, I think, might also imply that governance is not political, just a technocratic way of solving problems. So I was just interested to hear the panel's outlook on global law.
Okay, let's answer those, and then I have two more, and we take more questions. We're trying to close by about 3:15, 3:20. So if you have more questions, come up sooner rather than later. Partha, do you want to start this time around? Mark, do you have any comments?
So, the first one, loss of confidence in the US and the UN system goes back an awfully long way. I mean, the real loss of confidence, I suppose, is sometime in the 70s. But in fact, Heyman had already said in the late 40s, do you realise that what you've set up is a parliamentary system in which we run the danger of always being outvoted? Why on earth would we place our national interest in those hands? And he had an argument with Dean Rusk over this point, who was much more sanguine. So the UN had in fact already been set up to allow the US not to be bound by anything that the General Assembly might pass, but to allow the Security Council that kind of power. But the anxiety has always been there, I think, and therefore the idea that if only we mobilise the General Assembly, we'd have a better UN, I think there's always been around and has always run up against this fundamental blockage, because that's built into the architecture. I think the securitization of all areas of international politics is very striking. It seems to me it is mostly a post-9/11 labeling. Labeling would be too flip, not just labeling, but you see it emerging post-9/11. I mean, they have started earlier than that, and it seems to me connected to the previous question that it is part of the way in which the UN Secretariat knows that it can get Washington's attention post 9/11 if it securitizes issues that it once dealt with. It's more, I mean, that maybe I'm completely wrong and too cynical about that, but it seemed to me that was at stake. And of course there were all sorts of drawbacks to that. Global administrative law, again, absolutely, we're back to that old view that you could do without political passion. You could do without contestation. Who writes the technique of politics? Hans Frank. Governor General of Poland in 1942. He's the ultimate technician for, administrative law. And so the problem seems to me always not that administrative law replaces ideology, but that administrative law does not admit to ideology. And you see it clearly in a Hans Frank case, and maybe people don't see it so clearly today, but I find it disturbing.
Just on the GAL point, I would sort of add to this whole GAL project that there's something else. It's not, you can actually use law in a very non-transparent fashion, right? It doesn't necessarily go together, and therefore it's also not necessarily just expertise that you need and that experts govern us through administrative law at the global level, but you can also have private legal governance, and that's of course all over the place. And in the financial sector, it's every little financial instrument is legally constructed in such a way that it will not be subject to certain regulation and yet still enforceable. That's the catch, right? You need the enforceability, you need sort of the power of the state to make the system run, and yet you want to at the same time get around that in a way that is clearly not transparent. If you ever have tried to read a 300-page CDO or some of the other instruments, you will get the point. So I think there's a whole GAL sort of interesting worthwhile project, but I think there's a whole different level of legal scaling that doesn't necessarily have the same attributes that the GAL emphasize so much. I have two more right now, so you and Maciek, and then the third one. Okay, you go first.
So my name is Jonas Spendorf. I'm a visiting PhD student here at Columbia, and I'm interested in the way you have to think about international organizations, and I have the impression that the tendency is to think of them in terms of their claim to power and also their accountability to whomever. But I was wondering if it would not be more helpful to think of them as infrastructure through which knowledge and expertise, but also ideas and claims can travel back and forth between the different levels of the national and the international, and whether it would not help more to overcome some of what I think are misleading dichotomies between national governments and global governance, and between supposedly non-governmental actors and governmental actors, and whether they themselves are in a way a technology of scaling up and down between the levels, as you nicely phrased it.
My name is Mazower, I'm a doctoral student at the law school. So I think there's a notion that is implicit in this discussion that hasn't quite been spelled out. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about it and how it can shape the debate about governance. And it's the term ungovernability. So ungovernability can be understood on the one hand as an institutional insufficiency of certain arrangements to address certain problems. And I think the UN could be used as a case study for that. And then the second, I think, more fundamental dimension is what you could call a fundamental inherent ungovernability of certain types of things, issues, resources, assets to be subject to regulation. I don't know, maybe finance or maybe something else is just inherently incapable of being governed. So.
My name is Geert Sons, I'm a visiting scholar. I have a question to Professor Chatterjee. You very interestingly mentioned that in later phases of the formal empire, colonial government was relegated to expert government, and then even more interestingly, that after the rise of the UN, apart from the Security Council, whatever governance was being done in functional organizations by experts. Why is it that exactly in those moments and in those places this relegation to experts takes place?
Thank you.
Well, let me respond to this one. You see, the idea of colonial government being run by experts, which is largely, it's through the 19th century that develops. And before you come to the UN, there is an intervening period, which is the League of Nations. And I think that's a very, very important phase, when precisely, in fact, Mark does show this in his book, the actual people who, from the British colonial service, the French colonial service, the Belgians, people like that, I think Holland too, right? People who, with actual expertise in colonial service or with that kind of knowledge formation, get recruited into the League of Nations, in the various bodies, and in fact produces what you might call a whole disciplinary tradition of international administration, international governance, right, which continues right into the phase of the United Nations. So it's not entirely an unbroken tradition, it continues. Now, on the ungovernability question, you see, the interesting problem here, it seems to me, is this, that even in the heyday of the nation state, the problem of ungovernability of certain sectors, certain areas, maybe even certain regions was acknowledged. I mean, you will find many, many countries of the world where, certain spaces were recognized to be ungovernable, right? And the best way, there were attempts to contain them, to farm them out to other agencies, let them govern themselves if they want to. So, there could be, tribal areas, there could be areas of a kind of permanent insurgency. There were criminal areas. I mean, think of the mafia, for instance, right?
The untouchable.
Yes.
Yeah,
I mean, there are lots of these things where the states basically gave up. I mean, they said, we can't do anything. So it's not as though it wasn't there within those spaces. I think the interesting argument that's now emerged about ungovernability is that a lot of these spaces are seen to be either unacceptable. So, for instance, why is it the case that, let's say, Afghanistan or this frontier area of Pakistan, which from the British times was understood to be a place where, well, you just can't do anything, let them alone, right? Why is it that that is now seen to be an ungovernable place where you can't just let things be?
Exactly.
Right? And I think those kinds of problems are now emerging, and the argument increasingly is we can't leave it to the nation states because they can't actually tackle the problem. So we have to do something else. And I think those, and so I'm just thinking of physical spaces, but territorial spaces, but think of this in other sorts of ways, and I think increasingly there are many, many areas which are emerging, which in a previous era could well have been left alone by states as areas which either can't be governed or it wasn't worth trying. But now are not seen to be acceptable to just leave them alone.
So on the international organizations as infrastructure or as transmission belts for ideas, yes, I think it's a very rich idea, and it's very striking, not only recently, but back in the 20s and maybe back in the 19th century, the way international organizations served as places where people could try out theory, could try the whole issue of expert knowledge. But it also, there's another dimension that's perhaps worth mentioning. Michele Alacevic brings this out very well in his book on the early years of the World Bank and Hirschman, that actually Hirschman comes to a lot of the ideas that will lead to development theory through the very practical experience of going to Colombia with the World Bank and having debates internal to the World Bank about the appropriate kind of development strategy. So there it's not that you have the ideas and then the international organization is just a vehicle for disseminating them, but rather that the experience of being in the international organization, in fact, generates through practical situations a set of problems that you theorize about, and then that leads to another discipline and then goes back into the world. So I think that it's extremely important, and that's maybe one of their fundamental significances. And then, yeah, on ungovernability and sort of ungovernability as the nightmare of the governor, actually, the constant nightmare of the governor, right? But first, there's something specific about the UN here. I was always struck by this very remarkable figure, Robert Jackson, who I don't have time to go into, but who is asked to write a report on the UN. Late 60s, I think, very late 60s, beginning of the early 70s. And he's been in the UN at the start. Before that, he's been in British military service. He knows something about emergency administration. And he basically begins the report by saying, we've created a dinosaur with no brain. How have we done this? And that's early 70s, never mind now. So the ungovernability problem of how the UN, is it a single organization, is it a multiplicity of organizations, is right there. Where I'm more skeptical is whether there's fundamental ungovernability. I mean, it doesn't seem to me, why should finance be fundamentally ungovernable? It wasn't ungovernable in the Second World War. You had to get on and fight people, and so you imposed exchange restrictions. So it's a question of political will. Now we think exchange restrictions are very bad. And so the political will is all for abolishing them, and nobody argues for exchange restrictions. But that is a question of political will rather than a force of nature, I think, and so on for many other phenomena.
Just to add to that, I was going to say, maybe there's some things that are inherently ungovernable, but many are constructed to be ungovernable, and I think there's strategic actions by different actors to make them relatively ungovernable, which of course exacerbates the political problem, and finance would be the first exhibit in this particular type of argument. Okay, we have room for one more round of questions. I have one question here, or more coming, so I'll do 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but then brief, so I'll take 5. Go ahead.
Anita Golden, Fine Art, NYU. We've talked about ungovernability. We also talked about the heavy weight that of U.S. dominance in everything that we've been talking about. And I wondered if we could consider just for a moment if people's points of view on the effect of the paralysis in the U.S. government that we have now, and how that is, I know how I perceive it from inside, but how that's perceived from outside, and how that relates to everything that we've been talking about. Mm-hmm. We have, in my opinion, a glimpse at the possibility for the first time of the U.S. as a potential failed state.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, well, just to suggest that states have been failing for a lot of people for a long, long time. Failed state doesn't answer the question, failing for who. And so the much discussed period of neoliberalism and the redimensioning of state and private actors is something I just want to pull up for a second, because most states didn't actually shrink, they just repurposed. They were re-regulated to provide new kinds of goods for new actors. And one of those key actors that I just want to put on the table is the multinational corporations, which can be very provincial and kleptocratic at home, but act like, take Partha as an example, but can be very much a global competitor here in the United States. So not a monolithic or simplistic understanding, but where is that in our discussion? I mean, just to sort of outed my concern, but I think many states fail precisely because of the intervention of entities that are larger and have a specific interest and want law for one thing, but not for another.
That's right. Still rely on the law, though. I have Yuan in the back, and somebody else with a hand up on this side, which okay, Yuan, you said before, I don't think I'm going to do this again. Yuan.
Yes, Yuan Xiao, postdoctoral research fellow at Columbia Law School, working with Katarina directly. And before turning to academia, I actually worked for a few years with the World Bank. So my question or comment is, rather than talking about global governance, which is relatively fuzzy concept, wouldn't talking about global institutions be more productive to our discussion? We have been focusing so much on international organizations in our discussion today as if they are we know there's no central governing body of the global order, but we have talked so much about international organizations as if they can have such a huge impact on international order. From my own professional experience, I think international organizations don't really set the rules, and a lot of times are not the standard setters. If we focus on how the global institutions are shaped and formed instead, we can actually accommodate more by including international organizations, nation states, civil society, on how they each played a role in shaping the binding informal and informal institutions that have come in our region.
Thank you.
And it's been touched on briefly, but in terms of supranational power, we have this new development of, goes way back, of faith. And you're talking about jihadi groups. So right now the United States is particularly concerned, obviously, about Al-Qaeda and someone who just happens to go online and learns how to do a shoe bomb or whatever. And certainly Russia's involved with this in Chechnya. China's involved as well with their own Muslim groups. But these are transnational groups bound together. They don't necessarily agree with one another. So you have Sunni and Shiites who don't necessarily agree, but some want to see a transnational group of Islamists bound together, and that seems to be a transnational trend.
Okay, so 2 more questions. Is the U.S. a failing state? International institutional or global institutions, and then sort of the question of the Islamic networks. Who wants to start?
Well, I'll just take the last two, perhaps. Would it be better to talk about global institutions than global governance? And I thought then you were going to talk about a very relatively restricted range of things as institutions. In fact, but your list of things seemed to me to end up talking about many of the things that people who want to talk about global governance do talk about, such as NGOs and social movements and others. So it wasn't clear to me what the difference is. But I basically agree with you. I also agree with you that many national institutions are much more powerful global actors. US Treasury is probably one of the most powerful global institutions there is. So that I think we're probably all on the same page. In the case of transnational religious movements, then, which seems like a very new phenomenon, but actually historians are starting to get interested in this and have been for a while. But have been writing about pan-Islam and about pan-Asianism and pan-Africanism, and it's far from me to say that we should just learn everything from the history, but it does seem that the conclusion of the historians in most of these phenomena is they're much more weak than they appear. There's a rhetorical claim to community that does not translate into power, and that all of them, to be blunt about it, are failures. Pan-Asianism, Pan-Africanism, Pan-Islam in the interwar period. I mean, what does Pan-Islam?
Pan-Arabism.
It doesn't. They don't produce the results that they aspire to. Now we may be in a different era for all sorts of reasons.
On the question of the paralysis of the U.S. government internally, I don't think it's necessarily perceived that way from most parts of the world. I don't know. Sure, Chinese leaders probably have a much better sense of what's going on and what might be opportunities and so on. But if you think of a kind of general understanding of U.S. power in the world, I don't think there is actually an awareness that there is any kind of paralysis. Especially on the question of the overwhelming military superiority of the U.S. I mean, there's just absolutely no doubt anywhere in the world that if it wanted to, it could just go in and bomb any place out. So I think that's probably hasn't changed very much in terms of perception. On the question of the multinational corporations, see, one of the things that I think we've been trying to suggest is that particularly in terms of international legal frameworks and so on, that multinational corporations certainly rely on national states, they use nation states, they pressurize nation states, and yet they always try to escape the control of nation states, right? And that's been, that's been around for certainly in the last 30, 40 years. There are different techniques that have emerged of how to do this. But I think that is certainly the general conception. Obviously, now some multinationals do this more effectively than others. On the transnational Islamic networks, you see, one of the things that I think, irrespective of what they claim is their goal, one has to see them essentially as oppositional. They are necessarily they have a sense of what the enemy is, right? And what's the best way to try and attack the enemy. And that understanding has to do precisely with the fact that there are certain kinds of even military actions, even armed actions, which it's possible for this kind of dispersed groups to do, which is not the old kind of conventional warfare, obviously. It's also not the old kind of guerrilla warfare that the Vietnamese used to do, right? This is a different kind of arrangement, and it is still very much negatively defined. It's defined negatively, irrespective of whatever they might say is their ultimate sort of political objective. Yeah.
Let me just briefly pick up on your point about the U.S. Dysfunctionality internally. I think actually I would sort of disagree a little bit with you. After Iraq and Afghanistan, I'm not sure how powerful the U.S. is really being perceived. I mean, we would really have, just do bombardments, because certainly they're no longer being put boots on the ground. And so the political fights internally have implications. And even if they put boots on the ground, as they did in the two countries, it didn't seem to be all that effective. So I'm not sure about that. But I think more generally, I think I would amplify that my interpretation of the dysfunctionality of the political system here, but also the increasing dysfunctionality of political systems in Europe, is an increasing perception that this is not where the critical decisions are being made, right? So the governments have basically curtailed their own powers by delegating it to others. I don't think there's such a thing as really deregulation as delegating or giving space to other actors who come in and fill it, and multinational corporations are a key one. And what we see sort of the divisiveness is also because there's just no key responsibility to govern their people anymore, because the effectiveness of whatever they do is rather limited, so you can't even sell it to your own constituents. Anyway, I really, really appreciate all your patience in coming, and thank you, Partha.